Historically, Pontiac has been associated with cars like the GTO and Firebird, powerful engines, and a sportier character within GM. By the early 2000s, though, very little of that image remained. Most of the lineup consisted of front-wheel drive cars that were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from other General Motors models. Pontiac's problem was not a lack of cars. It was a lack of reasons to buy a Pontiac specifically. When Bob Lutz returned to General Motors in 2001, the man known as Maximum Bob decided to change that. He wanted to bring back Pontiac's sporting character, powerful cars, and make rear-wheel drive an important part of the lineup once again. One of the first attempts was the return of the GTO, and it was not especially successful. But perhaps one of the most serious efforts to restore Pontiac's old character was the G8. It was a powerful rear-wheel drive sedan, and exactly the kind of car you would rather associate with Pontiac's final years than the awkwardly styled Aztek, which unfortunately is far better known today than the G8. But first, let's go back to the beginning. In the 1960s, Pontiac was one of the most distinctive divisions within General Motors. It had its own engineers, its own engines, and a very clear identity. Within GM, Pontiac occupied a younger and sportier niche. This was the era that gave us the GTO and Firebird, and the brand was near the height of its popularity. The first problems began in the 1970s. New emissions regulations, the oil crisis, and rising insurance costs hit powerful American cars hard, but Pontiac still managed to preserve much of its identity thanks to the Firebird and Trans Am. More important changes were taking place inside GM itself. The corporation was gradually standardizing its divisions, while Pontiac was losing its technical independence. By the early 1980s, the brand had stopped producing its own V8 engines and was becoming increasingly dependent on shared General Motors components and platforms. The real turning point came with GM's reorganization in 1984. The old, largely independent divisions were grouped into larger structures, while engineering and production became far more centralized. This helped reduce costs, but it also began to erase the differences between Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick. Pontiac remained a successful brand for many years and was still selling hundreds of thousands of cars annually in the mid-1980s. But the problem was becoming increasingly obvious. Buyers had a harder time understanding what actually made a Pontiac different. The cars could have different bodies, interiors, suspension tuning, and more aggressive styling. But underneath, they increasingly shared the same GM platforms, engines, and components. During the 1990s, Pontiac increasingly tried to stand out through aggressive styling, performance versions, and advertising. But over time, that was no longer enough. A bold appearance did not always mean an equally distinctive character. And when production of the Firebird and Trans Am ended in 2002, Pontiac lost one of the last cars that still genuinely supported its old performance image. By the early 2000s, the traditional Pontiac formula had been almost completely lost. When Bob Lutz returned to GM in 2001, he wanted Pontiac to stop being just another variation of Chevrolet and restore the image the brand once had. Fortunately, he did not plan to achieve this through marketing or another round of aggressive styling alone. He wanted to bring back rear-wheel drive, powerful cars, and V8 engines. And the nickname Maximum Bob did not stick to Lutz by accident. He was known for his maximalist approach and his ability to turn automotive ideas into actual cars. When discussing the future G8, he openly said that Pontiac should offer an alternative to European sports sedans. It would cost considerably less, while delivering similar performance and driving experience. Developing an entirely new rear-wheel drive platform specifically for Pontiac made little economic sense, and there was no suitable architecture in GM's American lineup at the time. But there was one on the other side of the world, in Australia. By the mid-2000s, Holden had already spent around 1 billion Australian dollars developing an all-new architecture for the VE Commodore. This was not another reworked old Opel platform. It was a new rear-wheel drive architecture, capable of supporting different models with V6 and V8 engines. In other words, it was almost the perfect foundation for the kind of Pontiac Lutz wanted to build. And Holden had already proved what it could do. A few years earlier, Pontiac had brought back the GTO name, and while that experiment did not deliver the expected success, the basic idea of adapting an Australian model for the American market clearly worked. The new Commodore was far more modern and much better suited for the next step. In January 2007, Lutz even got slightly ahead of GM's official plans and told journalists directly that the new Commodore would come to the United States as the Pontiac G8. At the time, he called the decision completely logical. Just 1 month later, an almost production-ready G8 GT was shown to the public at the Chicago Auto Show. The press responded very warmly. For perhaps the first time in years, the idea of a new Pontiac was genuinely exciting again. Rear-wheel drive, a powerful V8, and the classic proportions of a sports sedan all looked exactly right for the brand. And most importantly, there was not long to wait. The G8 was due to arrive in showrooms in 2008. And it has to be said that the G8 really was a good car. The Holden platform worked exactly as it should. The engines and transmissions suited the character of the car, and the styling had just the right amount of aggression. Perhaps most importantly, despite its Australian roots, the G8 looked genuinely American. Wide Pontiac grills, hood vents, sharp lines, and muscular wheel arches. And all of it without any trace of the neo-retro styling that was so popular at the time. Considering that the G8 was built in Australia and then shipped across the ocean to the United States, the base price of $27,595 was more than reasonable, especially when the BMW 5 Series started at $44,300 in the United States at the time. The base G8 came with a 217 cubic inch V6, producing 256 horsepower, paired with a 5-speed automatic. Next came the GT, with a 364 cubic inch V8, producing 361 horsepower and a 6-speed automatic. Then, in 2009, Pontiac introduced the most powerful factory version, the GXP. Under the hood was a 376 cubic inch LS3 V8 from the Corvette, producing 415 horsepower. A 6-speed automatic was standard, but buyers could also pay extra for a 6-speed manual. The GT could reach 60 miles per hour in around 5.2 seconds, while the manual GXP could do it in just 4.5 seconds. For comparison, the BMW M5 E60, with its 500 horsepower V10, managed around 4.1 to 4.2 seconds in some tests, but cost more than twice as much as the GXP. So at least when it came to performance, Maximum Bob's idea really did work. Pontiac had managed to offer a very fast rear-wheel drive sedan for a completely different kind of money. There was also an extremely rare version called the G8 Firehawk, prepared by SLP. It was originally based on the G8 GT and its 364 cubic inch V8, but added a supercharger and produced around 500 horsepower. The package cost almost $19,000 on top of the price of the car. In the end, only 29 Firehawks were built, and 9 of them were based on the GXP. In 2008, when the G8 arrived at American dealerships, Pontiac sold around 15,000 cars. In 2009, sales rose to just over 23,000. That was still below GM's original expectations of roughly 30,000 cars per year. And the G8 really did arrive at almost the worst possible time. Sales began in the spring of 2008. That summer, gasoline prices in the United States climbed to around $4 per gallon, and by the fall, the financial crisis had entered its most severe phase, hitting both the car market and access to credit. A large, rear-wheel drive sedan, especially one with a V8, was hardly the most sensible purchase at the time. Yet, even under the same conditions, the BMW 5 Series sold much better, with around 46,000 cars in 2008 and another 40,000 in 2009. Perhaps GM should have simply waited out the crisis for another year or two and given the G8 more time to find its audience. But by the spring of 2009, the decision to eliminate Pontiac had already been made. And that was especially unfortunate because the G8 was already supposed to get a follow-up. Pontiac was preparing the G8 ST for the American market, a version of the Holden Ute, and essentially a return of the El Camino formula under the Pontiac badge. A wagon based on the Commodore Sport Wagon was also considered, so under different circumstances, the G8 could have developed into an entire family of rear-wheel drive Pontiacs. In 2010, Pontiac finally became history, and unfortunately the final years of this legendary brand are now far more often associated with the unsuccessful Aztec than with the much more deserving G8. This video turned out to be almost as short as the story of the G8 itself. In less than 2 full years, only 38,404 cars were built. Today, the G8 is not a common sight on the used car market, especially in good condition, and it remains a highly desirable car among enthusiasts. But the idea of selling a powerful rear-wheel drive Holden sedan in America did not die with Pontiac. For the 2014 model year, Chevrolet introduced the SS, built on a newer version of Holden's Australian platform. In many ways, it continued the same concept, although it also failed to become a major success with American buyers.